The year is 911. The River Seine is a highway for Viking longships. For years, they have used it to strike deep into West Francia. They have sacked Paris more than once. The Frankish kingdom is bleeding. Its king, Charles the Simple, is not a fool. He knows he cannot beat these Northmen everywhere, all the time. Fighting them is like trying to punch water. They raid, they retreat, they reappear somewhere else. The cost in silver and lives is unsustainable. The leader of the Vikings causing the most trouble is a man named Rollo. He is a giant of a man, by all accounts. So large that no horse could carry him, forcing him to walk. He is camped near the mouth of the Seine. He controls the gateway to the heart of Francia. Charles decides to try something different. He sends an archbishop, Franco of Rouen, to talk to Rollo. Not with swords, but with an offer. The offer is radical. Charles will give Rollo and his men a huge piece of land. It is the land around the lower Seine, the very territory they currently occupy. It will be theirs to hold, to farm, to rule. In exchange, Rollo must do two things. First, he must swear fealty to Charles. He will become a vassal of the king, a duke. Second, he must protect Francia from all other Viking raiders. He must guard the river he once used for plunder. He is being asked to become the gatekeeper. Rollo considers the deal. His men are tired of constant war. They want land to settle, a place to raise families. This is a chance for a permanent home, for legitimacy. He agrees. The meeting to formalize the treaty takes place at a small town called St. Clair-sur-Epte. The Frankish nobles are there. Rollo and his chieftains are there. The treaty is sworn. Rollo accepts the terms. He also agrees to be baptized, taking the Christian name Robert. There is one final piece of protocol. To show his loyalty, a vassal was expected to kiss the king's foot. Rollo refuses. He sees it as a deep humiliation. His men murmur their agreement. A compromise is reached. One of Rollo's warriors will perform the act for him. The chosen Viking walks up to King Charles, but instead of kneeling, he grabs the king's foot, stands up straight, and lifts it to his mouth. The king tumbles backward off his throne. The Frankish court is horrified. The Vikings roar with laughter. But the deal is done. The treaty holds. That territory became Normandy, the land of the Northmen. Rollo kept his word. He and his descendants defended the Seine. They became the Normans, a powerful force in European history. This wasn't a story of conquest through brute force. It was a story of negotiation. It was a pragmatic solution to an unsolvable problem. A king and a Viking leader looked at the endless cycle of violence and chose to make a deal instead. This act in 911 was not an exception. It was part of a pattern. The Vikings were not just raiders. They were traders, settlers, and often surprisingly effective diplomats. Number 19, the Law Rock was their parliament. In Iceland, there was no king. When Norse settlers arrived there starting around 874, they brought their social structures with them, but they left monarchy behind. They wanted a different way to live. What they created was one of the world's first parliamentary systems. It was a system built entirely on diplomacy and law. The heart of this system was the Althing, a general assembly held every summer at a place called Thingvellir, the Assembly Plains. Consider the story of a farmer named Gunnar living in the 10th century. His neighbor Thorkel has built a new fence. But the fence encroaches on Gunnar's land, cutting off a section of his best pasture. In many societies, this would lead to a feud. Swords would be drawn, blood would be shed. But in Iceland, Gunnar had another option. He could take his case to the Althing. So in June, Gunnar travels to Thingvellir. It is a massive gathering. People from all over the island come to trade, to celebrate marriages, and to settle disputes. The center of the Althing is the Logberg, the Law Rock. Here, the law speaker, a man elected for a 3-year term, recites 1/3 of the nation's laws from memory each year. It is a public performance of their shared legal code. Everyone hears it. Everyone knows the rules. Gunnar finds his local chieftain, his Gaudi. The Gaudi is not a ruler who gives orders. He is more like a lawyer and a political representative. Gunnar explains the situation with the fence. The Gaudi agrees to take the case. He approaches Thorkel's Gaudi. They talk. They present their arguments. They might call witnesses. The case is heard by a panel of judges selected from the chieftains present. There is no police force to enforce the verdict. The system runs on social pressure and honor. If the court rules that Thorkel's fence is on Gunnar's land, Thorkel is expected to move it. If he refuses, he can be declared an outlaw. This is a legal death sentence. Anyone can kill an outlaw without punishment. His property is forfeit. He is cast out of society. The threat of outlawry is powerful. It makes people respect the court's decisions. This entire process is diplomacy in action. It is a system for resolving conflict without resorting to violence. It requires negotiation, knowledge of the law, and respect for a common process. The men who created the Althing around 930 understood that for a society to function, there had to be a way for people like Gunnar and Thorkel to solve their problems with words, not axes. The Icelandic Commonwealth survived for over 300 years on this principle. It was a testament to the Viking Age belief that law and negotiated settlement were stronger foundations for a society than the will of a single king. Number 18A. Viking king became an English king's godson. By the late 870s, England was on the brink of collapse. Viking armies, known as the Great Heathen Army, had systematically conquered the kingdoms of Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia. Only one Anglo-Saxon kingdom remained, Wessex, ruled by King Alfred. The Viking leader he faced was a man named Guthrum. Guthrum was a king in his own right, a skilled commander who saw the final prize, all of England, within his grasp. In the winter of 878, Guthrum launched a surprise attack. He drove Alfred from his royal court at Chippenham and forced him into hiding in the marshes of Somerset. For a few months, it seemed that the story of Anglo-Saxon England was over. Alfred was a king with no kingdom, a fugitive in his own land. But he was resilient. He gathered his forces, the local militias who remained loyal, and prepared for one last desperate fight. The two armies met at a place called Eddington. The battle was long and brutal. Alfred's forces held their shield wall against the Viking charge. In the end, the Saxons were victorious. Guthrum's army was broken. The survivors fled to a nearby fortress where Alfred besieged them. After 2 weeks, starving and defeated, Guthrum surrendered. This is where the story usually ends in tales of war victory for one, defeat for the other. But what happened next was not about vengeance, it was about diplomacy. Alfred had Guthrum at his mercy. He could have executed him and his chieftains. Instead, he made a proposal. He offered peace, a lasting peace. The terms were laid out in the Treaty of Wedmore. Guthrum and his army would leave Wessex for good, but they would not be driven from England. Instead, the country would be formally divided. The Vikings would rule the north and the east, a territory that came to be known as the Danelaw. And Alfred would rule the south and the west. A border was drawn, trade and travel between the two realms were regulated, but Alfred demanded something more personal. He required Guthrum to convert to Christianity. This was a crucial diplomatic move. It brought Guthrum into Alfred's cultural and religious world. It created a common ground beyond the battlefield. Guthrum agreed. He and 30 of his most important warriors traveled to the Saxon court at Aller. There, they were baptized. Guthrum took the Christian name Aethelstan, and in the most remarkable gesture of all, King Alfred stood as his godfather. By becoming Guthrum's sponsor in baptism, Alfred transformed his enemy into a spiritual son. He created a bond of kinship. It was a masterful act of statesmanship. It acknowledged the reality of the Viking presence in England, but bound them into a new political framework. Guthrum honored the treaty. He settled in East Anglia and ruled as a Christian king. He even minted coins with his new name. The peace, though fragile at times, held. Alfred and Guthrum did not fight again. They had used negotiation and a shared ritual to end a war that force alone could not. Number 17, a Jelling-King chose a cross over a hammer. In the mid-10th century, Denmark was a kingdom taking shape. Its ruler was a man named Harold Bluetooth. He was the son of Gorm the Old, a king who had worked to unify the Danish tribes. Harold inherited this ambition. He wanted to create a strong, centralized Danish kingdom, but he faced immense pressure from his southern neighbor, the powerful and expanding Holy Roman Empire under Otto the Great. The Germans were Christian. They saw the pagan Danes as a target for both conversion and conquest. Harold understood the danger. A military confrontation with the empire would be disastrous for his fledgling kingdom. He needed a different strategy. He needed to present Denmark not as a barbarian threat, but as a respectable European kingdom. The key to this was religion. Around the year 965, a German cleric named Popo arrived at Harold's court. Popo preached the Christian faith. The Danes were skeptical. They had their own gods, Odin, Thor, Freya. Harold's court was filled with men who believed in the power of these gods. They challenged Popo. They asked him to prove that his Christ was more powerful than their deities. Popo agreed to an ordeal. He would undergo a trial by fire. A large piece of iron was heated in a fire until it was glowing red. Well, Popo, it is said, picked up the iron and held it in his bare hands. He walked with it for a few steps and then set it down. When he showed his hands, they were unharmed. The story of this miracle spread through the court. For Harold, this was more than just a religious sign. It was a political opportunity. He declared that he and all the Danish people would convert to Christianity. This was a monumental decision. It was not a simple act of personal faith. It was a calculated diplomatic maneuver. By adopting Christianity, Harold removed the primary justification for a German invasion. He could now deal with the Holy Roman Empire as a fellow Christian monarch, not as a pagan chieftain ripe for conquest. It opened up new avenues for alliances, trade, and cultural exchange with the rest of Christian Europe. To commemorate this event, Harold erected a massive rune stone at Jelling, the royal seat. This stone is a masterpiece of Viking art and a piece of political propaganda. One side shows a great beast. Another shows a figure of Christ, with arms outstretched as if on a crucifix. The inscription on the stone reads, "King Haraldr ordered this monument made in memory of Gormr, his father, and in memory of Thurv, his mother, that Haraldr who won for himself all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian." He was announcing his achievement to the world. He unified the country, he conquered Norway, and he brought his people into the Christian fold. The conversion was the capstone of his political project. It was a diplomatic shield. It allowed Denmark to survive and thrive, to integrate with Europe on its own terms, not as a conquered territory, but as an independent kingdom. Harold Bluetooth used religion as a tool of statecraft, securing his nation's future through a declaration of faith. Number 16, the Ruses merchants made a deal with the emperor. The Vikings who traveled east were known as the Ruses. They were Swedish in origin, and they used the vast river systems of what is now Russia and Ukraine as highways for trade and conquest. They sought the riches of the South silk, spices, and silver from the Byzantine Empire and the Arab caliphates. Their ultimate prize was the greatest city in the world at that time, Constantinople, which they called Miklagard, the Great City. In 907, the leader of the Kievan Ruses, a man named Oleg of Novgorod, decided he would not just trade with the Byzantines. He would force them to give him better terms. According to the Russian Primary Chronicle, he assembled a massive fleet of 2,000 ships. He sailed down the Dnieper River and across the Black Sea, appearing before the walls of Constantinople. The Byzantines, terrified, closed the harbor with a giant chain. Oleg's response was ingenious. He reportedly had his men pull the ships ashore, fit them with wheels, and then, with sails unfurled, sail them over the land, bypassing the chain and appearing at the city gates. Yeah, whether this actually happened is debated by historians, but what is not debated is the outcome. The Byzantine emperors, Leo VI and Alexander, were stunned. They knew a long siege would be costly. They sued for peace. Oleg was not there to burn the city. He was there to make a deal. He was a merchant prince, and he wanted a trade agreement. The Byzantines agreed to pay a huge tribute. But the real victory for Oleg was the treaty that was signed, likely around the year 911. This treaty was not a simple surrender document. It was a detailed commercial contract. The Russ's Primary Chronicle preserves the text of the agreement. It is a fascinating look into the priorities of these Eastern Vikings. The treaty granted Rus's merchants extraordinary privileges. They could live in a specific quarter of Constantinople for up to 6 months. During that time, they were to be supplied with free bread, wine, meat, fish, and fruit by the city. They were given access to the city's baths. They were to be provided with anchors, cables, and other naval supplies for their journey home. Most importantly, the treaty established duty-free trade. The Ruses could sell their goods, furs, wax, honey, and slaves in the markets of Constantinople without paying any taxes. This was a massive economic concession. The treaty also included legal clauses. It set out procedures for what to do if a Rus's merchant committed a crime in the city or if a Byzantine citizen wronged a Rus's. It was a comprehensive document that governed the relationship between the two powers. Oleg's campaign was a form of aggressive negotiation. He used the threat of military force not for simple plunder, but to secure a long-term economic advantage. He established a legal framework for his people to operate within the Byzantine world. For decades to come, this treaty and subsequent agreements, it formed the basis of the relationship between the Kievan Ruses and the Byzantine Empire. It showed the Rus as pragmatic businessmen who understood that a favorable contract was worth more than a city full of loot. Number 15, an Irish king hired a Viking fleet. The Irish Sea in the 11th century was a complex and violent place. Power was fragmented. Ireland was a patchwork of small kingdoms, all vying for supremacy and the title of High King. The Norse Gaelic cities on the coast, like Dublin, Wexford, and Waterford, were powerful players in their own right. They were centers of trade and naval power ruled by descendants of the original Viking settlers, who were now deeply integrated into Irish life. In 1052, the political landscape of the region was dominated by two powerful rivals. One was Diarmait Mac Mael na Embo, the king of Leinster in southeastern Ireland. The other was Ecmarcach Mac Ragnail, the Norse Gaelic king of Dublin and the Isle of Man. Their rivalry was fierce. The control of Dublin was the key to controlling Ireland's trade and a stepping stone to the High Kingship. Diarmait knew he could not defeat Ecmarcach's naval power on his own. The Dublin fleet, with its fast longships, controlled the seas. So Diarmait looked for an ally who could match that power. He looked north to the Western Isles of Scotland and the coast of Norway. He sought out a Viking fleet for hire. He made a deal with a man named Magnus Haraldsson. Magnus was the son of Harald Hardrada, the king of Norway. He was a prince with access to ships and warriors. Diarmait offered him silver and the promise of plunder in exchange for his help. This was a purely transactional diplomatic arrangement. It was a king hiring a foreign military contractor to achieve a specific political goal. Magnus arrived with a fleet of 32 ships. This was a significant force. Combined with Diarmait's own army, it tipped the balance of power. They launched a joint campaign against Ecmarcach. The details of the fighting are sparse, but the outcome was decisive. Ecmarcach was defeated and driven out of Dublin. Diarmait Mac Mael na Embo became the new king of Dublin. This was not a Viking raid in the traditional sense. It was a political alliance. The Vikings were not acting as independent plunderers. They were acting as mercenaries in an internal Irish power struggle. Diarmait used Viking naval strength as a tool to further his own ambitions. He was not a passive victim of raids. He was an active participant in the complex politics of the Irish Sea, using Viking power to his advantage. This kind of alliance was common. Irish kings frequently hired Viking fleets. Viking lords sometimes allied with Irish kings against other Vikings. The lines were blurry. A man's loyalty was often to his immediate lord and his own advantage, not to a broad ethnic identity. The story of Diarmait and Magnus in 1052 shows a world where Vikings were not just an external threat to be fought off, but a military and political resource to be negotiated with and deployed. They were part of the fabric of the political world, and smart rulers knew how to use them. Number 14, Knut the Great ruled an empire with letters. When we think of a Viking empire, we might imagine a realm held together by fear and the sword. But the North Sea Empire of Knut the Great, which at its height in the 1020s included England, Denmark, Norway, and parts of Sweden, was managed through sophisticated administration and diplomacy. Knut was a warrior, but he was an even better politician. He understood that long-term stability required law, cooperation, and good public relations. One of the best examples of his diplomatic approach is a letter he sent from Rome to his subjects in England in 1027. Knut had traveled to Rome, not as a conqueror, but as a pilgrim. He was there to attend the coronation of the Holy Roman Emperor Conrad II. His presence there, alongside the emperor and the pope, was a statement. It positioned him as a major Christian monarch on the European stage. But he knew his absence could cause instability back home. His empire was vast and diverse. He needed to reassure his people, especially the English, who had only recently been conquered by his father, Sweyn Forkbeard. So he wrote a public letter, a proclamation to be read out in churches and at assemblies across England. The letter is a masterpiece of political communication. It is warm and personal in tone. He begins by greeting his archbishops, his earls, and all his people in England. He tells them about his journey and the honor he has received in Rome. He mentions meeting the emperor and other kings and how they gifted him with precious things. This was meant to make his English subjects proud. Their king was a respected figure among the great rulers of the world. Then he gets to the heart of the matter. He explains that he used his time in Rome to negotiate for the benefit of his people. He had spoken to the Pope and the Emperor about the excessive tolls and taxes that were being charged to English merchants and pilgrims traveling to Rome. He proudly announces that he has secured a deal. From now on, his subjects would be able to travel to Rome more freely and securely without being hindered by barriers or tolls. This was a direct, tangible benefit for his people. He was showing them that he was working for them, even when he was far away. Or he was using his international prestige to solve their practical problems. He was not just a foreign conqueror, he was their advocate. The letter also contains instructions for his officials back in England. He commands them to govern justly. He insists that no one, rich or poor, should be denied justice. He demands that the royal taxes be collected fairly. He even declares that he has no need of money gathered by unjust means. He ends the letter by saying he is returning to Denmark to secure a lasting peace with the nations that had threatened them, so that England would have nothing to fear from any external enemy. This letter was a diplomatic tool aimed at an internal audience. It was Knut building consensus, demonstrating his value as a ruler, and cementing his legitimacy. He ruled not just by commanding soldiers, but by communicating with his people, by negotiating on their behalf, and by promising them peace and justice under the law. Number 13, a Viking lord became a Byzantine general. Harald Sigurdsson was a Norwegian prince with a problem. In 1030, at the age of 15, he fought alongside his half-brother, King Olaf, at the Battle of Stiklestad. They were trying to reclaim the throne of Norway. They lost. Olaf was killed and Harald was badly wounded. He had to flee the country. He was in exile, a prince with no kingdom and no future. He made his way east through the lands of the Kievan Ruses. He spent time at the court of Yaroslav the Wise in Kiev. But Harald was a man of action. He gathered a small band of followers and headed south to Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. He was looking for work. The empire had a long tradition of hiring elite foreign mercenaries. The most prestigious of these units was the Varangian Guard, the emperor's personal bodyguard, composed almost entirely of Norsemen and Russes. Harald and his men enlisted. This was a diplomatic choice. By entering the service of the emperor, he was placing himself under the protection of the most powerful ruler in the Christian world. He was gaining military experience, wealth, and prestige. He quickly distinguished himself. He was tall, strong, and a brilliant tactician. He rose through the ranks. For nearly a decade, Harold served the Byzantine Empire. He was not just a palace guard. He was a field commander. He fought for the emperor on multiple fronts. He campaigned in Sicily against the Arabs. He fought in Anatolia against the Seljuk Turks. He traveled to Jerusalem on a diplomatic mission. He helped suppress a Bulgarian uprising in the Balkans. The sagas claim he captured 80 cities. This is likely an exaggeration, but his military record was clearly impressive. He became incredibly wealthy, sending vast amounts of gold and treasure back to Kiev for safekeeping. His service was a long-term strategic investment. He was building a reputation and a fortune. He was also learning about governance, logistics, and strategy from the most sophisticated state in Europe. He was observing the complex world of Byzantine court politics. Around 1042, he decided it was time to go home. They had to sneak out of Constantinople after a dispute with the empress. He returned to Kiev, collected his treasure, and married Yaroslav's daughter Elizabeth. He now had the wealth and the political connections to make a bid for the Norwegian throne. He returned to Norway not as a teenage fugitive, but as a famous and wealthy general. He made an alliance with the King of Denmark and forced his nephew, the current King of Norway, to agree to rule jointly with him. A year later, his nephew died, and Harold became the sole King of Norway. He was known as Harald Hardrada, or Hard Ruler. His entire career was built on a series of diplomatic and strategic choices, fleeing to Kiev, enlisting in the Varangian Guards, serving the emperor, marrying a Rus's princess. These were the steps that allowed him to transform himself from a landless exile into a powerful king. His time as a Byzantine mercenary was a crucial part of that journey. It was a decade-long negotiation for his own future. Number 12, Ottar the Merchant, reported to an English king. In the late 9th century, a Viking chieftain from northern Norway named Ottar decided to take a journey. He was a wealthy man, a trader in furs, walrus ivory, and other northern goods, but he was also an explorer. He wanted to know how far the land stretched to the north and the east, so he set sail, rounding the northernmost cape of Scandinavia and venturing into the White Sea, a region unknown to most Europeans. He did not go as a raider. He went as a merchant and an observer. He met the local people, the Sami, and traded with them. He observed their customs. He mapped the coastline in his mind. He then sailed south to the Danish trading town of Hedeby and eventually made his way to England. In England, he found his way to the court of King Alfred of Wessex. This was the same Alfred who fought the Viking armies of Guthrum. But Alfred was more than a warrior. He was a scholar, a man deeply curious about the world. He was in the process of translating a Latin history of the world by Orosius into Old English. He wanted to update it to add new information about the geography of Northern Europe. Otter, the Norwegian Viking, was an invaluable source. Alfred and his scholars interviewed him. They listened to his stories of the far north, of the land of the midnight sun. Ottar described his home, a place called Hålogaland, the northernmost province of Norway. He told the king about his wealth, how he owned hundreds of reindeer, and how the Sami people paid him tribute in furs and feathers and walrus tusks. He then described his voyages. He gave a detailed, step-by-step account of his journey north and east. He named the ports he passed. He estimated distances and days of sailing. He described the lands as they changed from settled Norwegian territory to the empty wilderness of the north, and then to the lands inhabited by the Sami and other Finnic peoples. He explained that his main purpose on the journey into the White Sea was to hunt for walruses, which had very noble bone in their tusks. Alfred's scholars wrote it all down. They inserted Ottar's account and that of another traveler named Wulfstan directly into their translation of Orosius. The text still exists today. It is a calm, factual report. There is no mention of fighting or raiding. It is the account of a Viking merchant, a practical man of business, sharing his knowledge with an Anglo-Saxon king. This interaction was a form of diplomacy. It was a peaceful exchange of information between two cultures often seen as being in constant conflict. Alfred, the Saxon king, was willing to listen to and learn from Ottar the Norseman. Ottar, in turn, was willing to share his unique knowledge. The meeting shows that relationships between Vikings and their neighbors were not always adversarial. There was room for curiosity, for trade, and for the sharing of knowledge. Ottar was not a warrior in Alfred's court. He was an expert witness, a geographer contributing to a scholarly project. Number 11, the Vikings of Dublin became power brokers. When the first Vikings arrived in Ireland around 795, they came to raid monasteries for their gold and silver. But over the next century, their presence changed. They established permanent settlements, long forts, which grew into fortified towns. The most important of these was Dublin. By the 10th century, Dublin was no longer just a pirate base. It was a thriving multicultural city, the most important trading hub in the Irish Sea. The rulers of Dublin were descendants of Viking kings, but they were also deeply enmeshed in the world of Irish politics. They made alliances with Irish kings, married into Irish families, and adopted Irish customs and language. They became known as the Norse Gaels. They were a hybrid culture, and they used their unique position to become powerful political brokers. A perfect example is Olaf Cuaran, who ruled Dublin for much of the mid-10th century. His life story is a dizzying series of alliances and betrayals, a masterclass in political survival. Olaf was not just the king of Dublin. At various times, he was also the king of Northumbria in England. He was constantly navigating the treacherous politics of two different islands. In Ireland, he would ally himself with one Irish king to fight against another. For example, he might join with the king of Leinster to attack the king of Meath. A few years later, he might abandon Leinster and make a new deal with Meath. His loyalty was not to any one group. It was to the security and prosperity of Dublin. His primary goal was to ensure that Dublin remained an independent and powerful player in Irish affairs. His armies were a mix of Norse and Irish warriors. He used his wealth, generated by Dublin's extensive trade network, to hire mercenaries. His fleet of longships gave him a mobility that land-based Irish kings lacked. He could strike anywhere along the coast. This made him a valuable ally and a dangerous enemy. Irish kings who wanted to become High King of Ireland knew they often needed the support of the King of Dublin. Olaf's diplomacy was not about grand treaties or formal embassies. It was personal and opportunistic. It was sealed by marriages, by the fostering of children between families, and by sworn oaths. When an alliance was no longer useful, it was broken. This was not seen as treachery. It was simply the way politics worked in 11th century Ireland. The Vikings of Dublin had transformed from foreign raiders into an integral part of the Irish political system. They were one power block among many. Their military strength, naval power, and commercial wealth made them essential players. Kings like Olaf Cuaran were not mindless berserkers. They were pragmatic and cunning politicians using diplomacy, marriage, and shifting alliances to navigate a complex world and maintain their power. They had become kingmakers. Number 10. The settlement of Iceland was a legal agreement. The settlement of Iceland, which began in earnest around 874, was unlike any other Viking expansion. It was not a conquest. The island was virtually uninhabited. There was no native population to fight or displace. It was a planned, organized colonization driven by a desire to escape the growing power of King Harald Fairhair in Norway, who was consolidating the country under his rule and imposing heavy taxes. The men and women who went to Iceland were not raiders looking for plunder. They were families, they were chieftains, farmers, and artisans looking for land and freedom. They brought their livestock, their tools, their household goods, and their legal traditions with them. The process of claiming land was not a free-for-all. It was governed by custom and a shared understanding of the law. The story of the first permanent settler, Ingolfur Arnarsson, illustrates this. Before making landfall, he threw his high seat pillars through the large, carved wooden posts that flanked the chieftain's seat in a longhouse overboard. He vowed that he would build his farm wherever the pillars washed ashore. It took him 3 years to find them, but when he did, he honored his vow and established his settlement at a place he named Reykjavik, Smoky Bay, because of the steam from the geothermal hot springs. This act was more than just a religious ritual, it was a way of letting fate or the gods decide his location, removing personal whim from the decision. It established a legitimate claim in the eyes of the community. Other settlers followed similar procedures. A man could claim as much land as he could, walk around with a fire in one day, from sunrise to sunset. This was a practical system. It prevented any one person from claiming an impossibly large area. The land had to be physically marked and publicly claimed. As the island's population grew, these informal customs were not enough. Disputes over land and resources began to arise. The settlers, most of them refugees from a powerful monarchy, had no desire to create a new king. They needed a different system. They decided to create a common assembly, a place to make laws and settle disputes for the entire island. Around 930, a man named Ulfaljotter was chosen to travel back to Norway to study the laws of the Gulating, a regional assembly there. He spent 3 years learning the legal code. He returned to Iceland with a system of laws adapted for their new society. His foster brother, Grimmer Goatbeard, was tasked with finding a suitable location for the new National Assembly. He found it at Thingvellir. The establishment of the Althing was a collective diplomatic achievement. It was a social contract. The independent chieftains of Iceland voluntarily agreed to submit to a common body of law. They created a republic of sorts, a commonwealth that would be governed by laws, not by the sword of a king. The settlement of Iceland was not an act of aggression. It was a carefully managed process of colonization based on legal principles and culminating in the creation of a unique political institution built on the idea of negotiated consent. Number 9. Standardized weights made trade possible. Imagine a Viking Age market in a town like Hedeby in Denmark or Birka in Sweden. You see merchants from all over the known world. There are Roos's traders with furs from the deep forests, Arab merchants with silver dirhams from Baghdad, Frankish traders with wine and glassware, and local Scandinavians selling iron tools and amber. For this complex web of trade to function, there had to be a foundation of trust. How do you know you're not getting cheated? One of the most important tools for building this trust was the use of standardized weights and balances. Archaeologists at these trading sites have found hundreds of small lead weights. They are often round or square, and many are beautifully decorated. They have also found small foldable bronze balances for weighing precious metals like silver and gold. This was the technology of diplomacy in the marketplace. When a trader from Norway wanted to buy a silk cloak from a merchant from the Byzantine Empire, they didn't just barter. The price was often calculated in a specific weight of silver. Silver was the international currency of the Viking Age, but it wasn't used as coins of a fixed value. It was used as bullion. People carried it in the form of jewelry, arm rings, or chopped up pieces called hacksilver. The transaction would happen over a small scale. The Norwegian would place his hacksilver on one side. The Byzantine merchant would place his calibrated weights on the other. They would watch the beam of the balance. When it was level, the deal was fair. Both parties had agreed on a price, and they had a reliable, objective way to measure it. This system required a shared understanding. The weights themselves were remarkably consistent across vast distances, where a weight found in a Viking hoard in England is often very similar to one found in a market in Russia. This suggests that merchants had a common system of measurement, a kind of international standard. It allowed for complex transactions to happen relatively smoothly between people who might not even speak the same language. The development and use of these tools were a quiet form of diplomacy. It was the creation of a system that fostered peaceful exchange. It reduced conflict by making transactions transparent. It was a set of rules for economic interaction that everyone could agree on. When a Viking merchant produced his folding scale and his set of weights, he was signaling that he wanted to do business, not just take what he wanted. He was entering into a negotiation. This system was used not just for high-end luxury goods, it was used for everyday transactions as well. Archaeologists have even found weights used for measuring things like wax or spices. This level of precision in commerce shows a society that was deeply engaged in trade. The image of a Viking with an axe is powerful, but the image of a Viking with a delicate bronze balance and a set of lead weights is just as important to understanding their world. It represents their ability to create order and trust, the essential ingredients for any successful diplomatic or economic relationship. Number 8. A king's journey to Rome secured his borders. In the year 1027, Knut the Great, King of England, Denmark, and Norway, was in Rome. He was there for the coronation of the Holy Roman Emperor, Conrad II. This journey was not just a religious pilgrimage. It was a major diplomatic undertaking. For a Viking-descended king to be a guest of honor at the imperial coronation in Rome was a sign of his immense power and prestige, that he was being accepted as a peer by the most powerful rulers in Christendom. Knut understood the symbolic importance of the event, but he was also a practical ruler. He used his time in Rome to conduct a series of important negotiations that would benefit his subjects and secure his vast northern empire. He was far from home, but he was working to solve problems that affected people from the Ords of Norway to the farmlands of England. One of his primary concerns was the security of his northern borders in Denmark. The border between Denmark and the Holy Roman Empire along the Eider River was a frequent point of conflict. Knut wanted to formalize this border and secure a lasting peace. While in Rome, he had direct access to Emperor Conrad. Knut proposed a marriage alliance. He offered his young daughter Gunhilda to be married to Conrad's son, the future Emperor Henry III. This was a classic medieval diplomatic move. A marriage between the two royal houses would turn a political rivalry into a family alliance. It would bind the two empires together. Conrad agreed. As part of the marriage agreement, the two rulers settled the border issue. The emperor formally ceded the territory between the Eider River and a waterway called the Schlei to Denmark. This territory, which included the important trading center of Hedeby, had long been in dispute. By settling the matter through a treaty, Knut removed a major source of potential conflict. He secured his southern flank through negotiation, not war. He also negotiated on behalf of his subjects. As he detailed in his famous letter to the people of England, he spoke with the Pope, the Emperor, and other powerful rulers about the heavy tolls that were being imposed on merchants and pilgrims traveling south from his kingdoms. He successfully argued for a reduction in these fees. This was a direct economic benefit for his people. It made trade easier and religious pilgrimages more affordable. Knut's trip to Rome in 1027 was a demonstration of how a Viking king could operate on the international stage. He used his power and influence not just to win battles, but to forge alliances, secure borders, and promote the economic interests of his empire. He met with the most powerful men in Europe as an equal and used the tools of diplomacy, marriage alliances, treaties, and personal negotiation to achieve his goals. He was securing his empire's future with contracts and kinship, not just with longships and axes. Number 7, the Norse settled the Orkney Islands peacefully. The Orkney and Shetland Islands, north of Scotland, were a natural stepping stone for Vikings traveling west across the North Sea. Before the Norse arrived, these islands were inhabited by a people known as the Picts. The story of the Viking arrival in these islands is often assumed to be one of violent conquest, of the Picts being wiped out or driven away. But the archaeological and linguistic evidence suggests a much more complex and, in many ways, more diplomatic process. The Norse settlement of Orkney likely began in the early 9th century. These were not military fleets. They were farmers and fishermen from western Norway looking for new land. The islands offered good soil, excellent harbors, and rich fishing grounds. When they arrived, they found a Pictish population already living there. Instead of a story of sudden, violent replacement, the evidence points to a period of coexistence and gradual integration. Many of the oldest Norse farmsteads on Orkney are built right next to, or even on top of, older Pictish settlements. This suggests a transfer of land, not necessarily a violent seizure. It is possible that the Norse settlers, with their advanced farming technology and maritime skills, were initially welcomed or at least tolerated by the local Pictish lords. The place names of the islands tell a compelling story. Almost all of the major place names in Orkney and Shetland are Norse in origin. This indicates a complete language shift, but this does not have to mean a complete population replacement. A new politically dominant group can often impose its language over a few generations, especially if the two groups are intermarrying and living side by side. Some historians have argued that the Norse arrival may have been a negotiated process. The Pictish society was already under pressure. They faced threats from the Scots in the south. It is possible that some Pictish leaders formed alliances with the incoming Norse chieftains, granting them land in exchange for military support. The Norse newcomers might have married into high-status Pictish families, a common way of legitimizing a claim to land and power. By the late 9th century, the islands were firmly under Norse control, ruled by a powerful line of earls. The first of these was Ragnvald Eystein, a close ally of King Harald Fairhair of Norway. The king granted him the islands as an earldom. Ragnvald, in turn, passed the title to his brother Sigurd. This established a formal political structure. The earldom of Orkney would become a major power in the region for centuries. The story of the Norse in Orkney is not one of pure conquest. It was a slower, more complex process of settlement, integration, and cultural assimilation. It involved negotiation, coexistence, and the eventual emergence of a new Norse-dominated society. The Vikings who came to Orkney were primarily farmers and settlers, not raiders. They came to build a new home, and the evidence suggests they did so through a process that involved, at least some degree of accommodation with the people who were already there. Number 6, a Varangian's oath was a binding contract. When a Norseman like Harald Hardrada joined the Varangian Guard in Constantinople, he was not simply becoming a hired sword. He was entering into a formal contractual relationship with the Byzantine emperor. This relationship was defined by a solemn oath of loyalty. This oath was the foundation of the Guard's existence and a critical piece of diplomacy that bound these foreign warriors to the service of a distant empire. The oath was a serious matter. In a world where legal documents were not always common, a person's word, sworn before gods or God, was their bond. For a Varangian, this oath was sworn directly to the emperor. He pledged to defend the emperor's life with his own. He pledged to obey the emperor's commands without question. This was a personal commitment from one man to another. In return for this oath, the emperor made his own promises. The Varangian guardsman received a generous and regular salary paid in solid gold. He was given high-quality housing in the city, often within the palace complex itself. He was provided with the best weapons and armor. He was also given a share of any plunder taken on campaign. There was another unique privilege. When an emperor died, the Varangians had the right to pillage the palace. This was not a chaotic riot. It was an established custom. They were allowed to go through the imperial treasury and take whatever they could carry. This was seen as a final lump sum payment for their loyal service to the deceased ruler. It was an incredibly powerful incentive for loyalty. As long as the emperor lived, they would protect him, knowing this great reward awaited them upon his death. This system was a brilliant piece of political engineering. The Byzantine emperors could not always trust their own Greek nobility, who were often involved in plots and conspiracies. The Varangians, as foreigners, were outside of these local political factions. Their loyalty was not to a family or a political party in Constantinople, it was to the person of the emperor who paid them. They were a politically reliable force, an incorruptible bodyguard. The relationship was a two-way street. The Varangians provided the emperor with a loyal elite military force. The emperor provided the Varangians with wealth, status, and adventure. And it was a mutually beneficial arrangement, a contract built on an oath, and backed by the promise of gold. This system lasted for centuries. It brought thousands of Scandinavians and later Anglo-Saxons to Constantinople. They served the empire, and many returned home as rich and respected men. The story of the Varangian Guard is a story of long-term, institutionalized diplomacy. It was a system that allowed the Byzantine Empire to harness the military prowess of the Vikings, not by fighting them, but by hiring them, and binding them with a contract of loyalty that was honored by both sides. Number 5. The Ruses signed treaties in their own language. In the 10th century, the Kievan Ruses, the Viking-ruled state centered in modern-day Ukraine, was a rising power. Their relationship with the mighty Byzantine Empire to the south was a mix of raiding and trading. After Oleg of Novgorod's successful campaign against Constantinople around 907, the two powers signed a detailed trade treaty. But this was not the end of their negotiations. As circumstances changed, new treaties were needed. In 944, the leader of the Rus was a man named Igor. He led another major naval expedition against the Byzantines. This campaign was less successful than Oleg's. The Byzantine navy used its secret weapon, Greek fire, to destroy much of the Rus' fleet. Despite the military setback, the Byzantines were still keen to avoid future conflicts. They understood that the Rus' were a permanent and powerful presence on their northern border. It was better to have a stable, predictable relationship with them. So the two sides sat down to negotiate a new treaty. The resulting document from the year 945 is preserved in the Russian Primary Chronicle. It is an even more detailed and sophisticated agreement than the one from 911. It covers a wide range of issues from trade regulations and criminal law to military assistance. One of the most remarkable things about this treaty is how it was created. It was not a document imposed by the victorious Byzantines on the defeated Ruses. It was a bilateral agreement negotiated between equals. The Chronicle makes it clear that Rus's envoys traveled to Constantinople, and they presented their terms. The Byzantine emperor sent his own envoys back to Kiev to finalize the details. The text of the treaty itself shows this equality. It is written as if spoken by the Ruses themselves. We, of the Ruses nation envoys and merchants, Dawn sent from Igor, the great prince of Ruses, Dawn, to renew the old peace. The document lists the names of the Rus negotiators, and nearly all the names are Old Norse, not Slavic. Crucially, the treaty was created in 2 languages. A Greek version was kept in the imperial archives in Constantinople. A second version was written for the Ruses. Historians believe this version would have been written in Old Norse, using a script like runes, or possibly an Old Church Slavonic, a new written language that was just beginning to spread. The Ruses would swear their oaths to uphold the treaty according to their own customs. The pagans among them swore on their swords before the idol of their god Perun. The Christians in the delegation swore their oaths in a church. This was a significant act of diplomatic recognition. The powerful ancient Byzantine Empire was treating the upstart Ruses state as a sovereign power. They were creating a bilingual, legally binding international treaty. The Ruses were not seen as illiterate barbarians. They were seen as a nation with its own laws, its own language, and its own accredited representatives who could negotiate and sign a treaty on behalf of their ruler. This document from 945 is a clear example of the Vikings engaging in formal, high-level diplomacy, creating a lasting legal framework to manage their relationship with a neighboring superpower. Number 4, Eric the Red sold a dream to create a colony. By the 980s, Eric the Red had a reputation. He was a tough, charismatic, and hot-tempered man. Born in Norway, he had been exiled to Iceland with his father for some killings. In Iceland, he settled down, but his temper got the better of him again. After a series of feuds with his neighbors that resulted in more deaths, he was sentenced to 3 years of outlawry by the Icelandic Althing. This meant he had to leave Iceland or risk being killed by anyone without penalty. Eric needed a place to go. He had heard stories of a large land to the west, sighted decades earlier by a sailor named Gunnbjorn Ulfsson, who had been blown off course. Eric decided he would use his 3 years of exile to explore this land. Around 982, he set sail with his family and a few followers. He found the land a vast island with a forbidding, icy coastline, but he also found deep fjords with green, grassy pastures in the southwest. He spent his 3 years of exile exploring, mapping the areas that were suitable for farming. He saw the potential. When his sentence was up, he sailed back to Iceland. He didn't just return quietly. He came back with a plan. He needed to recruit settlers to go back with him and establish a permanent colony. To do this, he needed to sell them on the idea. He engaged in a brilliant piece of marketing and public relations. He called the new land Greenland. Well, he reasoned that people would be more attracted to a place with a pleasant name. He described the fertile valleys he had found, the rich pastures for grazing sheep and cattle. And he likely downplayed the immense ice cap that covers 80% of the island. He painted a picture of opportunity, a new world with free land for the taking, a place to escape the crowded valleys and legal disputes of Iceland. His diplomacy was aimed at his fellow Icelanders. He held meetings, he spoke to chieftains and farmers. He used his charisma and his first-hand knowledge to persuade them. It worked. The sagas say that in the summer of 985, a great colonizing expedition set out from Iceland. 25 ships carrying hundreds of people, along with their livestock and all their worldly possessions, sailed west. Only 14 of the ships made it through the stormy seas, but it was enough. They established two main settlements, the eastern settlement and the western settlement, in the green fjords Eric had identified. Eric himself took the best farmstead, Bertalid, and became the paramount chieftain of the new colony. This was a remarkable achievement. Eric the Red used persuasion, not force, to create a new society. He identified a problem, his own exile, and land shortages in Iceland. He found a solution, the new land. And he used skillful promotion to convince hundreds of others to join him in a risky venture. The Greenland colony would survive for nearly 500 years. Its creation was not the result of a king's decree or a military conquest. It was the result of one man's powers of persuasion, a diplomatic effort to build a new community from scratch. Number 3, hostages were a bridge between two worlds. In the Viking Age, a peace treaty was often more than just a piece of parchment. It was a living arrangement secured by human collateral. The practice of exchanging hostages was a common and essential tool of diplomacy. It might sound cruel to modern ears, but it was a deeply serious way of guaranteeing that both sides would keep their word. A hostage was not a prisoner in a dungeon. Often they were high-born children of the leaders involved, and they were treated with honor. Consider the treaty between Alfred the Great and the Viking leader Guthrum in 878. After Guthrum's defeat at Edington and his baptism, a formal peace was established. To ensure the peace would hold, hostages were exchanged. Alfred would have sent some young Saxon nobles to live in Guthrum's court in East Anglia. Guthrum, in turn, would have sent some of his own key followers or their sons to live at Alfred's court in Wessex. These hostages served a dual purpose. Their primary role was as a security deposit. If Guthrum were to break the treaty and attack Wessex, the lives of the Viking hostages at Alfred's court would be forfeit. The same was true in reverse. This gave both leaders a powerful personal incentive to maintain the peace. An attack would mean sacrificing the sons of their own friends and allies, but the hostages were also diplomats in their own right. A young Viking nobleman living in the Saxon court would learn the Old English language. He would come to understand Anglo-Saxon customs, politics, and religion. He would form personal relationships with the people there. He might even become friends with the sons of the king. When he eventually returned home, he would be a bridge between the two cultures. He would be an expert on his former enemies, a man who could advise his own king on how to deal with them in the future. This process, over time, helped to break down the barriers between the Vikings of the Danelaw and their Anglo-Saxon neighbors. It fostered a degree of mutual understanding. The same was true for the Saxon hostages living in the Viking court. They would learn the Norse language and see that their new hosts were not just mindless killers, but people with their own laws, poetry, and social structures. The practice of fosterage was closely related. A chieftain might send his son to be raised in the household of another allied chieftain. This created a powerful bond, as close as family. The fostered child would grow up with a foot in both worlds. The use of hostages was a pragmatic and deeply human form of diplomacy. It recognized that trust was fragile. It used the most valuable thing a leader had, the lives of his people and his children, to back up his promises. It turned a political agreement into a network of personal relationships, weaving the two societies together and making a return to war a much more difficult and costly decision. Number two, the Normans traded their longships for castles. The story of Rollo and the Treaty of 911 was just the beginning. The Vikings who settled in Normandy did not remain Vikings for long. In one of the most remarkable transformations in European history, they assimilated into Frankish culture with incredible speed and effectiveness. This process of assimilation was itself a form of long-term diplomacy, a conscious choice to adapt in order to survive and thrive. Rollo and his followers were given land, but they were surrounded by a Frankish population that was larger and had a more established culture. To rule effectively, the Norse leaders had to adapt. They adopted the French language. Within a generation or two, the Old Norse language had all but disappeared from Normandy, surviving only in a few place names and nautical terms. They adopted the Christian religion not just in name but in practice. They became patrons of the church. They rebuilt the monasteries that their own ancestors had raided. They founded new abbeys and churches. By doing so, they gained the support of the powerful church hierarchy and became integrated into the religious life of the kingdom. They also adopted Frankish military technology and strategy. The classic Viking way of war was based on the longship, on lightning raids and surprise attacks. The Franks, on the other hand, fought with cavalry, with knights in heavy armor. They built castles of earth and timber, known as motte and bailey castles, to control the land. The new Dukes of Normandy embraced these methods. They became masters of cavalry warfare and castle building. The longship was replaced by the warhorse as the main symbol of their military power. They also adopted the Frankish system of feudalism. Rollo became a duke, a vassal of the king. His chief warriors became his vassals, granted land in exchange for military service. This created a stable social and political structure very different from the more fluid tribal leadership of their Scandinavian homeland. This rapid transformation was a strategic choice. By becoming French in language, religion, and military practice, the Normans made themselves indispensable to the French kingdom. They were no longer a foreign threat. They were the powerful and loyal defenders of the kingdom's northern frontier. Their duchy became one of the most organized and formidable political entities in Europe. This process of diplomatic adaptation reached its peak in 1066. William, the Duke of Normandy, was a direct descendant of the Viking Rollo, but he was in no way a Viking. He was a French-speaking Christian feudal lord. When he crossed the channel to claim the throne of England, he did not come in longships to raid, and he came with a fleet of transport ships carrying an army of knights and archers. He came to conquer and to rule, and he brought with him the language, laws, and architecture that would fundamentally reshape England. The Normans showed that the greatest diplomatic skill can sometimes be the willingness to change, to adapt, and to become something new. Number one, they chose to obey the law. The common image of the Viking is a figure of lawlessness, a berserker driven by rage, ignoring all rules. But the reality is that Viking Age Scandinavian society was deeply concerned with law and order. Their laws were not written down in big books in the early part of the era, but were preserved in the memory of wise men and recited at public assemblies or things. This legal system was the bedrock of their society and their most fundamental diplomatic tool. Consider the case of Egil Skallagrimsson, the famous 10th century Icelandic poet and warrior. He was a violent and difficult man, but even he was subject to the law. In Norway, he got into a dispute with King Eirik Bloodaxe and Queen Gunhild. He killed one of their sons. He was declared an outlaw in Norway. He could not simply ignore this. He had to flee. Later, in England, he was shipwrecked and found himself in the power of his old enemy, King Eric, who was then ruling Northumbria. By all rights, Eric could have had him killed on the spot, but Egil did not resort to violence. He used a different tool. He stayed up all night and composed a magnificent poem in praise of the king, a head ransom poem. The next day, he recited it for Eric. The poem was so brilliant and the gesture so bold that Eric, bound by the customs of honor and the The respect due to a great poet spared his life. It was a negotiation, a legal and poetic argument for his own survival. Within their own communities, law was paramount. The thing was the venue for all important decisions. People went there to settle property disputes, to arrange marriages, to prosecute criminals, and to make new laws. The process was public, arguments were heard, evidence was presented, judgments were made by a panel of one's peers. This respect for legal process was a form of everyday diplomacy. It was a commitment to resolving conflict through an agreed-upon system rather than through personal violence. Of course, feuds did happen. The sagas are full of them, but the law was always there as an alternative. A person could choose to pursue a feud, or they could choose to prosecute a case at the thing and seek financial compensation for an injury or an insult. The fact that the legal option existed and was, frequently used shows a society that valued order. Even raiding parties abroad had their own rules. The ship's crew, the falag, was a company bound by a shared code of conduct. Plunder was often divided according to a prearranged system, with the leader and the ship's owner getting a larger share. This prevented internal disputes from tearing the crew apart. The ultimate expression of this legal-mindedness was the creation of national law codes. In Iceland, the laws were eventually written down in a book called Gragas Grey Goose Laws. In Norway and Sweden, regional laws were also recorded. The act of writing down the law was a move toward greater stability and predictability. It was a declaration that theirs was a society governed by rules, not just by the whims of the powerful. This deep-seated respect for law was perhaps the most Viking diplomatic trait of all. It was the understanding that a shared set of rules was the only way for any society, whether a farmstead, a ship's crew, or a nation, to function and prosper.